It would make our lives more rational, make our lives more coordinated. It would solve the fact that the week is this sort of frustratingly independent time unit.
Hi, I'm Brilliant, your host for this show. I know that I'm incredibly blessed. As the son of self-made billionaires, I've seen the high price some people pay for success, and I've learned that money really can't buy happiness. But I've also had the good fortune to learn directly from many of the world's leading teachers. If you're ready to be, do, have, and give more, this podcast is for you. My guest today is David Henkin, author of a book called The Week, A History of the Unnatural Rhythms That Made Us Who We Are. I first became aware of David's work when I came across an article in the Atlantic magazine titled, "We Live by a Unit of Time That Doesn't Make Sense." And while that's not totally true, in my opinion, there's a lot about this world that doesn't make sense. There's a lot about time that doesn't seem to make sense. And David explores that. He is a professor of history at Berkeley. His research interests include America since 1607 and the way that timekeeping affects the ways that we live. His book's website explains that we take the 7-day week for granted, rarely asking what anchors it or what it does to us. Yet weeks are not dictated by the natural order. They are, in fact, an artificial construction of the modern world. An investigation into the evolution of the 7-day week and how our attachment to its rhythm influences how we live is what this book is all about. I am a learning nerd. If you know me, you know that. I really enjoyed this book. I learned a lot about it. But one of my biggest takeaways, and I don't want to steal the thunder of this interview, is just how much of the world in which we live really is constructed of social agreements. And what's cool to me about that is if we made it up once, we can make it up again. So I hope you enjoy this interview, learning from David. I really enjoyed this book. I loved talking to David. I think he's a fascinating guy, exploring some interesting things. So if you are, like me, a fellow learning nerd, I think you'll enjoy this conversation. Before we end, as I usually do, we get into David's writing habits and routines, and he has some fascinating answers as well in the Enlightening lightning round about travel, about money, and about other things. So with that, I hope you enjoy this conversation with my new friend, David Henkin. David, welcome to the School for Good Living.
Nice to be here, Brilliant. Thank you for having me on.
Will you tell me, please, what is life about?
I can't speak for anybody else, but for me, life is about making connections with people, lifelong connections, connections with individuals, connections with groups, connections with people you just met, connections to people you know you're never going to see again, connections with people that you think might actually transform your life. That's it for me. Yeah.
I love that. Tell me, how do you go about that?
I go about that, I guess, by trying to be open to the possibility that someone will be in my life forever, and also open to the possibility that I'll never see them again. Keeping both those things in mind, I think, has helped me listen to people, help me be aware of people, and help me think about what life looks like from their perspective.
That reminds me of something someone once told me about people enter your life for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. You know, and I really like that philosophy.
I've not heard that, but it's nice.
Yeah. So something I've really been yearning to know the answer to, and if there's anyone on the planet that can answer, I'm believing it's you. Will you tell me definitively, does the week begin on Sunday or Monday?
All right. Well, the week begins whenever you want it to begin, but in most places in the world that I've been able to figures out for, think of the week as beginning on Monday, and they think of the week as having what we call a weekend, right? So the week ends with the days that you take off. In the United States, pretty distinctively, the week, I think, does normatively begin on Sunday, and in the period that I have studied, the 19th century, it was defined by law as beginning on Sunday. And there are reasons for that. And it's really, I'd say, mostly the legacy of Puritan Sabbatarianism. So this is a little bit in the theological weeds, but happy to go there, and we can just stop when it gets too detailed. So for much of the history of Christianity, especially in the Catholic Church, the idea was that the Lord's Day was really quite different from the Sabbath of the Hebrew Bible. So the method of counting days in the Hebrew Bible didn't really bind Christian practice, but Puritan Sabbatarians, and especially in England and in Northern Europe, disagreed. After the Protestant Reformation, they began arguing that, in fact, the Christian Sabbath was rooted in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and in the prohibition of work on the seventh day, but that after the resurrection, that was shifted to the first day. So they maintained the Hebrew Bible's count, which is 6 days you shall work, and on the seventh you shall rest, and the seventh was Saturday. But they said no. But now we will. Now we rest on the first day. So by keeping the count, it made Sunday the first day, and in fact many Puritans and Quakers and other sort of I call them dissenting Protestants who are not part of the Church of England, didn't use the essentially pagan names that we use for the days of the week, naming them for the planets, and instead called them first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day Sabbath, which is a way of naming days in lots of languages. It's certainly the way of naming days in Hebrew, which makes sense. But also, interestingly, there are languages like Greek and Portuguese that also use that numbering system. But the funny thing is that in Greek and in Portuguese, you still begin on Monday, which is called second day. So second day, third day, fourth. Right. So in English, we don't use the ordinal day names. We don't call them by the numbers. But in the United States, there is a religious tradition of using the number days, and the number days always follow the Hebrew Bible. So they always follow the assumption that the day we call Sunday, which is the Lord's Day for Christians, is actually day one, not day seven.
This is something obviously you go deep into, and so much more that I find fascinating in your book, The Week, a history of the unnatural rhythms that made us who we are. And part of what I love so much about this inquiry, it's the kind of thing that many people, I think myself included, don't really give a lot of thought to, yet it's part of a world that we're born into. And there's these agreements that we just accept as true, right? Or real. And I suppose they are, because they shape our lives and we all seem to abide by them. But something that I just find really interesting is how much of it really is changeable. Right? How much of it through, like you were saying, there are actual laws or there's, agreements that are created or differences in cultures. But so how much of it is changeable? And then the other thing that's really remarkable to me about it is how little of this with the week actually ties, or maybe none, ties to natural systems, right? Which I had no idea. I feel really ignorant now. But let me just back up a little bit, because I definitely want to dive into both of those things. But I know that writing a book is no small task, that these things take, in many cases, years. It's a lifetime of research or curiosity that you put into, a project like this. Why did you write this book, and how did you hope the world would be different because it exists?
Okay, the first question is probably easier to answer than the second, but okay. So for the first question, I'd say a couple of things are relevant background about me. One is more short term, which is that for the last 30 years, so that's the more short term answer. But for the last 30 years, I've been a historian of the United States, and I'm interested in my teaching and in my writing about the origins of the modern world, and especially exactly what you were just talking about, Brilliant, about the kinds of unspoken agreements that we have that structure our lives. So I study ordinary people and ordinary life in 19th century America, and I try to figure out what changed in their lives that made their society more recognizably modern, because I have always had the suspicion that that was the period when lots of the rules were written, lots of the structures and institutions that we don't think about were introduced. So we do think about some of them. We think about, industrialization or railroads or electromagnetism or certain forms of capitalism, but we don't think about things that don't have spectacular technologies or weren't spoken about a lot of the time. So I've written a number of books at this point about things that I think really changed ordinary life in 19th century America, that I see as sort of part of the construction of the unspoken agreements we have of about what connects people. So that's one answer, which would say that I decided over the course of my study that the 7-day week was actually a very powerful institution and was shaping life in new ways. The longer answer is that I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home in New York City, and my own life was and continues to be thoroughly shaped by the weekly calendar, in many ways more than by other calendars. So I understood. So I always knew whether it was Tuesday or Wednesday, and had all kinds of practical implications. But I noticed that the rest of the world seemed to be that way as well. I could explain how that came to be for my own family, but I was wondering how that really came to be for everybody else. And in some ways, being part of a minority religion in the United States sort of alerted me to the way which people can experience the world quite differently. Yeah. And we talk often about those differences. And sometimes it's harder to explain the similarities. And the week is one of those institutions that binds all kinds of people and who often think that their lives are quite different. It nonetheless allows them to be on the same page, or in this case, on the same calendar. So those are probably the two big, broad reasons why I became interested in writing a book about the week. They asked how I thought the world would be different. I mean, I tend not to allow myself to imagine that anything I write is going to make the world different. But I did hope that this would do two kinds of things for two kinds of people. I primarily hope that people who think about time, and there are lots of such people out there, who are used to thinking about time in terms of clocks, would come to appreciate the ways in which calendars actually play a huge role in structuring our sense of the passing of time, including like this incredibly short time that we have on Earth. People think about that question all the time. I thought calendars play an interesting role in that. People usually don't think about the week. So I thought that would be, wouldn't change their lives, but I thought that would speak to people's curiosity. And then I also thought that the much smaller group of people who study 19th century America might start to notice the way in which the week is a kind of unacknowledged building block. Maybe all people who study history, an unacknowledged building block of the societies and the experiences that we all study. So I tried to write this both for readers who don't usually read about history and for readers who do so all the time.
Right on. Well, I know I emailed you kind of over the holidays. As we're recording this, it's January of 2022, and this was one of my holiday reads. I really enjoyed a lot of it. Was totally new information to me, and just learning things as simple as, the 7-day, although there does seem to be, I don't know what you would call it, like a coincidence or synchronicity to many cultures that have used and have lived by a 7-day week, but it's far from the only one. I had no idea that in the French Revolution, the Decade, like a 10-day week was proposed or actually implemented, as I understand, in Russia, a 6-day week, in Africa, other days, or in places like Mexico or Japan, that it was brought there. It was imposed by legislation at a point in time that we can get to, right? But will you talk about why is it? Oh, and this one too, I really want to explore with you, that clocks ran for 8 days in the United States, right? What's up with an 8-day clock? What is that about?
So, this is all right, we'll start with that one. This is something I feel like I never fully unraveled, and I spoke to clockmakers and read a little bit about clock history. But in this period, a dominant clock form was a clock that you had to rewind every 8 days. And I suspect and continue to believe that that's not a coincidence. I mean, there were some technological limitations associated with it, and there also were 30-day clocks. But I think it was decided that 8 days was sufficiently long that people wouldn't mind rewinding, and an 8-day clock does fit the week because it allows you to rewind it at the same point in the cycle and never actually run out. Right? For clocks, it's better to rewind them too early than too late.
Sure.
Like filling up your gas tank. So so that's why I think it was useful. I notice it because we often look to clock history and the history of chronometric devices to figure out how people's experience of time changes. So I was doing research to see whether people had clocks that actually measured the week. And except for Thomas Jefferson has some special clock that he designed. A couple other inventors did so, but ordinary people didn't have a machine that told them what day of the week it was. But they did have this machine that kind of reinforced what they already experienced, which is that the time goes by in these 7-day intervals. So if you live a life where when Sunday rolls around, or even when Tuesday rolls around, you sort of feel like, 7 days have elapsed since the last time I did X. I spoke to my mother, went to the gym, whatever. That reminds you that if you have to rewind your clock, you do so. So the 8-day clock was really a popular early and mid 19th century device, and then ultimately clocks changed. But yeah.
Interesting. So in the book, I want to come back to Thomas Jefferson, but I want to do it in the context of something you mentioned early called, I think you call it time consciousness, right? What is time consciousness and why does it matter?
Good question. I mean, time consciousness could include a couple of things. It can include time perception, just, our sense of how much time has elapsed from one event to another. But there's also time consciousness in the sense of our awareness of the flight of time, the passing of time, and our awareness of where we are in some larger time frame. And that has to do with our own mortality. It has to do with our sense of coordination with other people. Yes, all of those things for me count as time consciousness. Yeah.
So with Thomas Jefferson, I remember reading his name in the book for some of the ideas he proposed about neighborhoods and one school per 6 miles and so forth. But I don't remember you mentioning any of the special timepieces he had. What will you talk about that?
Well, Thomas Jefferson was an inventor, and he apparently, I haven't seen it. I don't know if it survived, but he owned of his own design a special clock that was set to indicate, it was a calendar clock. And there is a big, beautiful one, a very old one from the early modern period in Strasbourg, France, that I've seen also. You can design a clock to, in the same way we have watches that tell us what the date of the month it is. You could have a clock that tells you the calendar as well, that is set to every 24 hours, flip a day, or every 7 days, flip a week. The month is a little bit harder to do, but you can do that as well. And Thomas Jefferson owned one of these, and he was quite proud of it. But yeah, that may have been a footnote in the book. I don't recall where it was. I'm pretty sure it made its way in.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So something else that I want to explore as it relates to time consciousness and again, the mutability of time and the social agreements and so forth is, will you talk about what happened? Excuse me. Will you talk about what happened between Wednesday, September 2nd and Thursday, September 14th?
In 1752, you mean?
1752, yes.
Yeah.
Where were you last year? No, it's 1752.
So this is a cool thing. All right. So the Christian world adopted the Julian calendar that was used in Rome and spread it across much of Christendom over centuries. And the Julian calendar assumes that the year is 365.25 days long, that the solar year is that long, but it's not. It's slightly less than that. So what happens is slowly over time, the calendar year and the solar year they begin to diverge, right? You don't really notice it in your lifetime because it's really moving so slightly. But over centuries, it does actually begin to be noticeable, and it changes, say, the relationship between Easter and the equinox and things or change the relationship between the calendar equinox and the observable equinox. So the Pope Gregory instituted the Gregorian calendar, which makes a small tweak that we still observe today, which is to say that instead of having a leap year every 4 years, we have a leap year mostly every 4 years, but 3 times every 400 years, we skip the leap year.
And that's still part of what we practice?
Yeah. So you and I will lead lives that I assume we will lead lives where we actually have a February 29th every 4 years. But our grandparents did not, because in 1900, we didn't have a leap year.
No, this would really mess, because this is how I remember presidential elections. It's every leap year, but that was always the case. Right.
So but in 1900, and we guess it may have been bad luck. The guy who was elected in 1900 was assassinated shortly into his second term. But the scheme is that every 100 years you forego the leap year, but every 400 years you reinstate it. So in 2000 we did have it.
Wow.
But in 2100 we will not have a leap year.
I had no idea.
That's the fix, right? And that's great. But what do you do about all of the centuries where you missed that? How do you correct to get it? So when the Gregorian calendar was adopted by different parts of the Christian world at different times, in Russia, for example, they didn't adopt it until after the Bolshevik Revolution. But in the British Empire, they adopted it, imposed it in the 18th century, and they imposed it on the colonies in 1752. And it did a couple things. One thing, again, is it meant that they wouldn't have a leap year in 1800, but that wasn't a noticeable thing. It did one thing that was quite noticeable, which was it switched the beginning of the year from March to January, which is sometimes confusing when people look at things that happened in the United States. Like George Washington was born before this change took place, and he was born as we observe it in February. He was born February 22nd. But the question, what year was he born, is a complicated question. So we say 1732, but at the time it was actually 1731 because they thought they didn't flip the year until March 1st. So that was one change that took place. But the other thing was they decided to eliminate certain dates in order to get the calendar back aligned with what it would have been had they been counting it properly all along since the time of Jesus. And so they said we have to get rid of 11 days. So they got rid of 11 dates on the calendar. They disappeared.
Just for that one time, knowing they would be there next year, but hey, we're just going to kind of skip past these.
Correct. I mean, one way you could describe it is they said all along our dates have been wrong. Right. Like if suddenly we discovered that actually we messed up, our calendar's messed up. We thought today was January 14th, Turns out it's actually January 25th. So we're not skipping those days. We're just correcting the calendar to compensate for our miscount. Or you could say we're skipping those days. But what they didn't do was skip any weekdays, right? They kept the weekly count. Yeah. And the weekly count, remarkably, has been kept so far as everyone is concerned from its inception. There have never been religions, societies, cultures, nations, political movements that have disputed with one another as to where we are in the weekly count, even though there's nothing in the natural world to let us know whether we're right or wrong. And the reason why people figured out that the Julian calendar was a problem was because they could see that it's March 21st, but the sky doesn't exactly look like what it should look like on March 21st
because of the equinox.
Exactly. Yeah. Or really, detailed, sophisticated studies of the skies could have made that clear to people at many points. And it's really with better astronomical observation that this became apparent. But with the week, that would never happen. There's nothing that you can look at it in the world and say, you know what? We thought it was Wednesday, but actually it's Tuesday. Yeah. Because the only thing that keeps the week in place is human record keeping.
That is so wild.
So you'd think that we would disagree. We keep different records, right? Or we lose our records or something like that. But we don't disagree. The only at this point, the week is now a global timekeeping system, and everyone agrees. The only thing that is subject to disagreement, I suppose, would be where the international date line is or should be.
Yeah.
But apart from that, the entire world agrees. You can call it different names. You can disagree about where it starts. You can disagree about what it means. But no one disagrees about whether we have maintained this continuous count of 7-day cycles. God, yeah.
It's really, I mean, I might just be a nerd on this, but to me, it's mind-blowing. And it is on so many levels, from the synchronization of global activity, where all these different cultures now, for the most part, I'm sure there's still pockets here and there that might maintain their own practices or whatever, but that we really have unified in a way that, as far as we know, has never happened in human civilization, as one thing. And another is this, it's like a theme I keep coming back to about the mutability, that I just love this idea that we said, and like, hey, we're actually wrong. We're wrong about what the date is. Let's get corrected. And on that topic, I'm curious, by the way, like, who is they? Like, who is it that's driving this? Is this, I mean, obviously you've talked about religious leaders, and there's politicians involved, and I'm sure there were civic leaders and stuff like this, but how did this decision get made? Like, how did it get implemented and then rolled out?
Well, it's interesting. At different time periods, I would say church leaders, ecclesiastical leaders, religious leaders have been the main forces. In the last 150 years, it's been governments. I mean, we call it the Gregorian calendar because the reform took place under Pope Gregory, and it was with his authority. And the Christian societies that did not adopt it, didn't adopt it because they didn't recognize the authority of the Pope, which is why it came later to Protestant societies, and it also came later to Eastern Orthodox societies. So the they is really, I would say, religious authority, and the Islamic calendar and the Jewish calendar; those were all determined by religious authorities, and sometimes by the states that imposed that religion. The state was a religious authority. But there are all these things that have happened in the last 150 years, like time zones.
Yeah.
Those are introduced often, in the case of time zones, were introduced by private corporations, like railroad companies had the need to coordinate clocks across time. And so they devised systems of time zones, but ultimately governments had to ratify that, impose that, and they did by international agreement. Or I'll give you one other example: what we call daylight saving time, where clocks are officially moved 1 hour back or or forward for various purposes. That's done by governments, right?
I hate that. I seriously hate daylight saving time.
You hate the switch, or you hate being in one of the two phases?
I hate the switch. And my understanding is that here in Utah, we've actually passed legislation that it will end, as it has in places like Arizona, or I think Hawaii doesn't observe it, if our neighboring states will also agree. I'm like,
right. No, I mean, I think there is a big move to eliminate the switch. But one of the problems is that even people who agree with that disagree as to which they want to keep it as. It's a little easier for Arizona, but they're sort of a little in between time zones. So I don't think there's strong disagreement as to whether they should always be standard time or always be daylight saving time, because it's also unclear whether they should be mountain time or Pacific time. So there's kind of splitting the difference by being mountain standard all year long. But and Utah is also like borders a time zone, so they could make that decision. So they could be mountain standard. But they're a little bit. You guys are a little bit further east than Arizona. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, but things like time zones and daylight saving are all conventions. They were imposed by governments, and the International Dateline would be another. They're all kinds of collective agreements that were, I'd say, basically agreed upon internationally around the period following World War I or during World War. The World War played a large role in creating a kind of international order that could do something like that. So, speaking of which, there was the same people who introduced these ideas of uniform mean time zones and summertime and all that also wanted to reform the calendar. They wanted to solve a real problem, which is that the week doesn't fit into any other calendar unit. It's not a neat subset of a month or a year or a century or anything else.
Yeah,
it's the only calendar unit like that. Sorry?
Yeah, not the 7-day week, right?
Well, no, the 7-day week doesn't fit in, right? Because the year is 365 days long and it's not divisible by 7. So when I say to you today is Friday, January 14th, in some sense, Friday, January 14th, 2022 is a redundancy. I mean, right? January 14th, 2022 is by definition Friday, but we have to actually say also Friday because it's additional information because it changes every year. So this causes all kinds of confusion. People often make appointments and they say, "Oh, I'll meet you on Friday, January 13th," and then you don't know. Well, there is no Friday, January 13th.
Yeah.
But you could have a calendar where every January 13th was the same day of the week, and you could have a calendar where there was exactly the same number of weeks in every month and in every year, and that would solve all kinds of problems with accounting. And since people typically only work. People will work by the week, but they sometimes get paid by or assessed by the month or the year. It's a technical accounting problem that they don't fit. So the same reformers who had all these great ideas about how to standardize time in other ways, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll create a year that's essentially 364 days long plus some extra days. Those extra days would be part of the year, but they wouldn't be part of the week. They would be what people called extra hebdomadal, outside of the weekly cycle. So you could go, for example, from Saturday, December 31st to blank holiday. And then the next day would be Sunday, January 1st. And it would solve problems. So then if you did that, then every year would have the same alignment of weeks of dates and days, and that didn't fly. It was one of those reform movements that's had lots of support and momentum and prestige, but ultimately it went up before the League of Nations, and it was defeated and continued to sort of surface periodically thereafter. But by World War II, it was sort of clear that movement died. So the week is on the one hand seems like one of the most changeable units of time because it wasn't universal and it was not really dictated by nature or even suggested by nature. On the other hand, it's proven to be one of the most difficult to change. It's one of the most entrenched calendar units that we have. And even though it causes all kinds of problems for other systems of timekeeping, like the month and the year, no one really wants to tinker with it. And this was a change not in its how long. It wasn't like the French Revolution wanted to make it 10 days. It wasn't like the Soviet Revolution that made it 5 days and then 6 days and tried to make it non-synchronized. This was leaving everything about the week alone. It just says 1 day a year or 2 days on a leap year will be blank. They'll have no weekday value. And that switch to the structure of the week proved unacceptable to masses of people in throughout the world, and especially in the West, where the movement took place. Yeah.
So, is this what's the international fixed calendar?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and that was amazing to me to read about that, and to read that as you said, it was very prominent. Like it actually seemed to have a lot of support, and people like Kodak and people like the Sears, Roebuck and Company actually used this.
Yeah, no, George Eastman of the Kodak Corporation was in some ways one of like the real sort of the fathers of this movement, or one of the leading lights. And he approached it primarily from an accounting standpoint, but then it turned into a much larger movement that we could really all be on the same. It would make our lives more rational, make our lives more coordinated. It would solve the fact that the week is this sort of frustratingly independent time unit.
Yeah. Well, if I have it right, you write in your book that Kodak adopted this in the 1920s as an accounting practice, as you said, and then held on to it all the way until 1989. Right?
Yeah, I forget when they stopped doing that, and if I said it in the book, then I hope it's correct.
I've got it right here that says Kodak would maintain this accounting practice until 1989, and its founder George Eastman devoted extraordinary energy and resources to advocating what he saw, in the words of his contemporary biographer, as quote, a natural evolution in modern life, as inevitable as was standard time in 1884. That's crazy to me in a way, that they maintained this like asynchronous. It was asynchronous with the rest of society, a 13-month accounting calendar for like 70 years, as late as almost 1990.
Yeah. I mean, one way to think about it is that he was just obsessed with something that he thought would be better for the world, and he had the power and authority to impose it on his employees. Another way to think about it, though, is that lots of work cultures adopt their own calendar. We're familiar with it. Industries like hospitals that have to run continuously, airlines that have shifts that often straddle days and weeks. They create some version of their own calendar. Yeah. Schools increasingly sometimes have schedules that don't quite conform to the week for various reasons we could talk about. So you could think of Kodak as being one of those workplaces. It didn't have to be. There was nothing about working for the Kodak Corporation that made the usual calendar problematic. But people often come to adopt a different calendar for work purposes. Yeah,
that makes sense. And you see that even with something as simple as like a fiscal year, the difference between the calendar year and the fiscal year. So that makes sense. But one thing I'm really curious to know from your view is what would so two things. One is, would we, in your opinion, would we be better off as a society if we implemented something like the international fixed calendar? Or what might the benefits be? That's the first question. And here I'll stack questions. But the second is, do you see any major changes like this happening if you stretch out and kind of imagine hundreds of years into the future for humanity? And I know if we do achieve, if we go to Mars or we achieve interstellar travel, of course, this will change the way I think we think about time and our time consciousness. But do you see on this planet in the next decades or centuries that we will implement any major changes related to the way we think about or use time? track time?
Tough question, especially when you frame it as broadly as the way we think about or use time. I'm sure there are. I have no particular insights into that. If you narrow it to the question of whether we're likely to change anything about the week, I do have some thoughts. I don't think we're likely to change the to go with a fixed calendar, to go with these extra hebdomadal days. I also don't think that if we did, it would change the structure of our lives all that much. But anyway, it would just be weird, right? Because it would be weird to have a day that, so it would require a lot of mental adjustments. I don't think it would have a lot of practical consequences, except it have enormous practical consequences for the hundreds of millions of people on the planet who were attached to the week for religious reasons and would continue to experience their religious obligations on the old calendar. So that would be a really difficult thing. Yeah. And so a Muslim who wanted to treat Friday as a climactic prayer day would continue to do so, but now would be operating on a calendar that wasn't aligned with secular society or with business, because Jews who wanted to observe the Sabbath or everything else about Jewish liturgical life would continue to keep the old calendar. So it would create that kind of problem. Yeah, but I don't think actually living within an international fixed calendar would feel any different, because it's still 7 days. It'd just be weird every year that you had this holiday. But we experience that weirdness already. I mean, often when you have a holiday on a Monday and everyone else, such a short week, I thought it was Tuesday. Right. So that weirdness, I think we could live with. Whether we might have less of a need for a coordinated calendar at all as certain technologies develop, or if we were to travel to places that cut us off from the astronomical rhythms of the Earth. I think that's definitely possible. I think that the kinds of electronic calendars that we already use that often obviate the need for remembering stuff or even having your appointments be regular. If my computer is really good at telling me, and I actually tend not to use electronic calendars. I have paper calendars like this one with you, but as more and more of us have computers that will just essentially tell us when we have to go to the dentist, and when our violin lesson is, and when we have to pay alimony and all that, we might not need to use the week as much as we do as a mnemonic device. And I think that would be really, a really significant change. I don't look forward to it. I don't think that would be fun or good for us necessarily. But I do think it's a subtle change, but that could happen that big. When I began writing the book, I was wondering whether the things that hold the week in place for us were unraveling, and some of them are. Telecommuting, definitely a big difference. And I think we sort of saw that, the effect of working from home also during the pandemic. Because, of course, one of the big things the week does is it aggregates temporally as well as spatially work from non-work. Yeah. The more that's been eroded by 24/7 commerce and 24/7 accessibility, the more that crucial feature of the week is jeopardized. I also suspected that one of the big things that anchored the week for many people in my generation was, and even the generation after me, was synchronized entertainment. So your television show appears on this, movies come out on this moment. All these synchronized entertainment forms really shaped our experience of the week, and I do think that they did, and that's definitely changed now with asynchronous entertainment, with one huge exception, and I think we're able to really perceive its significance now, and that's sports. So live sports, especially live team sports, and most obviously football, really rely upon the technology of the week to stagger, coordinate the activity of playing and watching watching games. And that kind of used to be the way entertainment worked in general, with theater and television and radio. And increasingly, it really is just sports, but sports are extremely popular in the United States, and football is an especially popular one. So, okay, so those are all some things, ways in which the week could be losing its grip on us, and they do make a difference. But after the pandemic shutdown, I'm more and more convinced that we're still so attached to these rhythms. We're so attached to the idea that our Tuesdays will be different from our Wednesdays that I don't think the week is unraveling so soon.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. All right. Thank you for that perspective. Well, we've covered a lot, and I appreciate you indulging my curiosity in so many of these things. I'm curious, what did you learn in the writing of this book that surprised you? What really like stood out to you?
Well, one thing that was important to me, but I'm not sure it's all that interesting to non-historians, was I sort of figured this change would the change that I saw, which was that a change from thinking of the week primarily as just dividing weekdays from weekends, or secular and sacred time, or labor and leisure, that the week began to really differentiate all 7 days. Like in other words, that I thought that the emergence of the kind of week that we have, where we care not just whether it's a weekday or weekend, but we have very different lives on say Wednesdays than we do from Thursdays. I thought that would have emerged in the middle of the 19th century, and over the course of my research, I decided it actually happened a little bit earlier. So that's the kind of thing that historians care about. But for most people, mid 19th century, early 19th century are basically just the same thing, old times. So that may not be so interesting, but that is an honest answer. I guess I was surprised by some of the things that didn't seem to mark the week for people. I had thought, for example, that food would play a huge role, as it has in more recent periods. Food rituals, the sort of early equivalents of the kind of Taco Tuesdays, or just institutional food provision would anchor itself to the week, so that you'd have this real visceral memory. Oh, Wednesday is going to be pizza, or Friday fish, and there was a lot less of that in the United States than in the time period that I studied than I would have expected. That was sort of a little bit surprising. I was sort of hoping and expecting to find more women thinking about how their menstrual cycles either aligned with or deviated from patterns, and I couldn't find much evidence of that. So there were definitely things I had sort of expected to find and didn't find. But the truth is that it was less a story of being surprised at what I saw than a story of my being happily surprised by what I was able to confirm. I sort of felt like, okay, well, in my experience, and we all do this, in my experience, I think of the week this way. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that's idiosyncratic. And then you wonder whether other people think about the week that way too. And then you wonder whether they thought about the week in the past that way. And then you wonder whether they left any evidence that they did. And I was happily surprised that the answer to all those questions was kind of yes. Mm-hmm. I found all these people thinking about the week in ways I thought of as idiosyncratic. Yeah. And I found them speaking about it. And I found that it was connected to memory. That's probably the major discovery. Might be a little bit strong and a little bit misleading, because I did wonder about it, and it's hard to prove anyway. But the big punchline that I wasn't sure of when I started, and I was more sure of when I finished, was that the week is really a mnemonic device, and it's attached to both the powers and the perils of human memory for us in a number of ways. And the part of the reason why we experience time passing quickly when we think about it in weeks is because of that. We remember our lives as a succession of weeks. We remember what we did on a certain Tuesday. We remember it as a Tuesday. We don't remember it as like a 17th of a month. And so the week plays this weird role in our in the grasp that we have, or the grasp that we lose over our pasts. That's not its most practical function. Its most practical function, I think, really is coordinating and scheduling activities among strangers.
Yeah.
The modern week does for us, and it didn't do a long time ago, is allows people to organize their lives in the future with some sense that a repeated activity will be easiest to coordinate and schedule if it's on the same day of the week, and easiest to remember. So that's the biggest thing that the week does. It's something very practical, logistical. But the deeper thing that the week does, and it's connected to the fact that we have weekly schedules and weekly habits, is it really anchors our memory. We relate to the recent past, and even a little bit to the distant past, by thinking about weekly cycles. And to me, that's a deep, that's sort of a deep insight into the implications of weekly timekeeping. Because when you say that what a week does, which is, I think, true in the modern world, is it coordinates schedules. That sounds like, it's maybe just a disciplinary device, or a way just to get us all to fall in line, and that may not sound so interesting. But when you think about the fact that the week is the calendar unit through which we both experience and account for our pasts, you have some sense that the stakes of this technology are more interesting.
Yeah. Well, especially if you do a thought experiment, like what would life be in the absence of weeks or named or even numbered days? Just continuous span of time. Like, what is that?
So to me, that's a really interesting question, and the way you frame it suggests that you think that we would be somehow cut loose, and I think that we would.
Yeah, I don't know if you use this word, or like a temporal dislocation.
Yeah, temporal dislocation or disorientation, one of those. Yeah, no, I think that would be true, and I think of the problem that way, because usually when you tell people what would we do if we didn't have weeks, they assume the stakes of that would be some kind of unsettling of the relationship between labor and leisure. And that would be true as well, of course. But that's not all that a week does. Right? Mm-hmm. So if we didn't have weeks, we'd probably come up with some other system for alternating labor and leisure. I mean, I would hope that we would. And lots of societies that didn't have weeks had very different systems for alternating labor and leisure, often systems that were particular to a class or an occupation, or a sector of a job market. And that's true. But I think that what you're saying is actually kind of at least more interesting, and maybe in some ways more frightening. Like, if we didn't have the calendar units that we had, could we imagine an experience of time that essentially homogenized all days?
Yeah.
They're just days. And that's what people complained about during the pandemic shutdown. Yeah. They talked about Blur's Day or this day and that day. They were complaining about the homogeneity of time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the last thing I want to ask in this part of the interview is about this disconnection from natural cycles, right? As you point out in the book, it's not tied to, and in this conversation you've mentioned, like equinoxes and solstices and solar cycles and lunar cycles,
but tides or anything like that. Yeah.
So there's all these natural, and so this is where I might be connecting dots that really don't deserve to be. They have no connection, perhaps. Mm. But I have this theory, like that as I live, that I think a lot of what I experience is the unworkability on this planet, the depression, the anxiety, the loneliness, the meaninglessness, the ecological devastation, is this sense of disconnection from the natural world. And this is where the connecting the dots that don't really have a connection might be happening. But I wonder if the way we're living And this week is such a significant part of our experience, the way we think about and structure and use time, but it's not tied to the natural world. And no wonder there's this drift, this separation, this lack of appreciation or even reverence for nature. I don't know what the question is here, but there's something about the week and the implications of the fact that it is not actually tied to a natural cycle. What are your thoughts about what that really means, and what the impact of that is for us as humans?
Okay, I think that's a great question, and I sort of think it's a question that other people have raised with me, and I think I have a different perspective from you. But I should preface it by saying that I think yours is the more I think is the more common perspective, the more popular perspective, and mine's maybe the more obstinate and idiosyncratic one. Okay. So as I understand you, Bill, you're suggesting that if we really organize our lives by time units that have no discernible connection to the natural world, it's just going to reinforce our alienation from nature, and it's just going to enforce unhealthy ways of living and unhealthy ways of using the resources on the planet. So I'll preface this by saying that I don't disagree with you about how our ways of living are unhealthy, about our alienation, or about our irresponsible use of planetary resources. I think I get the sense that you and I are completely on the same page. I personally, though, don't think that the fact that the weekly time unit is unnatural plays a big role in that, and there are a few reasons. One is just to start. There are a lot of naturally based time units that have also changed historically, and that also might be oppressive or alienating. So I don't think that just because something is natural that it means that it's necessarily good for us, or that it, there are a lot of things in nature that we live by that produce conflict and destruction also. So I'm not someone who thinks that because something is number two is that many of our time units that are rooted in some way in nature at this point are pretty artificial also.
Yeah.
So like day and night are obviously natural time units, but we don't really live by astronomical day and night. We live by clock day and night, and so that's a natural time unit because it's certainly it's enforced on some level by light. But the fact that we work 8-hour days, I don't know what people work 10-hour days, whatever. That's not suggested by daylight, because daylight varies by latitude, but it varies by season. And then there's the month. I mean, the month is certainly suggested by a lunar cycle, but in Jews and Muslims and other societies as well notice where we are in the lunar month. But in the United States, most people don't, and Christians don't. So the month has become completely artificial too. The Gregorian month is roughly lunar in length, in average length, but it is not lunar in phase, right? Knowing that today is January 14th doesn't suggest that we are a full moon. Right. It has nothing to do with the moon. So a lot of things that are time units that are natural are really experienced as not natural, or have been transformed, and others just aren't really natural at all, like the month. And then the third thing I would say is that people have been so surprised. This is not a surprise about my research. It's a surprise about the reception of the book. Almost everyone I've spoken to has been very interested. Some of them have been surprised. Some of them have actually taken issue with my claim that the week is artificial. All of those reactions suggest that we don't actually really experience the week as artificial. We experience it as natural, and that's why people didn't want blank days, because it seemed to really misrepresent something fundamental about the character of time. Because we do think that today really is Friday, and you can't just say that no, it's actually Thursday. Even though you really could, and nothing, nature would never correct us. So that's why I'm skeptical as to whether if the week is doing damage to us, which it could be, but I'm skeptical that the reason would be that the week is distinctively artificial. Again, just to make sure I've sort of said one is that I don't think that natural time is necessarily any better for us. Two, I don't think that the time units that we have that are rooted in nature are actually really natural anymore. And three is most people don't experience the week as artificial, so maybe it doesn't actually estrange them from nature. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, great points. Yeah. Okay. Well, with your permission, I want to go ahead and transition us to the next part of the interview, the Enlightening Lightning Round. The Enlightening Lightning Round is a series of questions on a variety of topics. My aim, for the most part, is to ask the question and just stand aside, let you answer, but also to keep us moving. So you're welcome to answer as long as you want, but one of my aims here is for my part to be concise. Okay. All right. Question number 1. Please complete the following sentence with something other than a box of chocolates. Life is like a
mystery.
Okay. Number 2. Here I'm borrowing the technologist and investor Peter Thiel's question. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
There's so many. It's not good to wake up early in the morning.
Okay. You said there were so many. Was there another that popped to mind as well?
Well, that the only way to lead a meaningful. Sorry, I'm trying to frame it as the thing that I think or the thing that they think.
Yeah.
Very few people would agree with the idea that you can have a meaningful life without having children.
Oh, without having children. Okay. All right. Thank you. Question number 3. If you were required every day for the rest of your life to wear a t-shirt with a slogan on it or a phrase or saying or a quote or a quip, what would the shirt say?
I love the alphabet.
Okay. Question number 4. So what book other than one of your own have you gifted or recommended most often?
Maybe Cherry by Mary Carr or The Mezzanine by Nicholson Baker.
I'm not familiar with either of these books. Why these books?
One's a memoir, one's fiction. I tend to recommend books to people because I think that they would like them. These are both terrific books, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend them to the same person, but they are distinctive and beautiful. And I don't know. I think that I think friends appreciate books where they recognize something distinctive in the way they think or talk about the world. And then when you give someone a book, they recognize that that's also a bond that they share with you.
Right on. All right. Question number 5 deals with travel, like in the good old days when we used to do that sort of thing. But what is one travel hack, meaning something you do when you travel or something you take with you to make your travel less painful or more enjoyable?
I mean, I have so many boring answers to that question. I travel very, very frequently, and I do many, many little things.
Perfect.
So this is in some ways a good question, sometimes a bad question, because I do things like in San Francisco Airport, I'll check in the international terminal for a domestic flight because I'll get a shorter line on clear and TSA pre-check, and then flip to the other flip to the other terminal. What I do if I'm accompanying a friend to a flight and want to see them to the gate, I'll purchase a frequent flyer award ticket on their flight to get through security, and then I'll cancel it and redeposit the miles after I say goodbye to them at the gate. I travel very lightly. I pack very lightly, and I travel with very little. I'm sure lots of other kinds of baggage, but very little physical material baggage. Yeah, those. I all kinds of credit card shenanigans and things of that sort that make it more affordable.
Wow.
To travel. Yeah. We
Awesome.
could go on. We could go on with that subject for too long. So as I say, it seems like a good question for me, but it's actually a horrible one because
All right.
Because I have too much to say about that subject. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like that. If you don't already have one, like there's a whole blog right there just waiting to be written.
Yeah, and I read some of those blogs too.
I'll just share with you because you mentioned traveling light. There was a guest on the show a couple of years ago, Alan Weissman. He wrote The World Without Us. Mm-hmm. Talks about where he'll travel internationally, and many guests have said this, that they only travel carry-on.
Yeah.
He said that one of the things that he'll do is he's gone to the sporting goods store and bought one of those fly fisherman's vests. So he can just pack it. It's another small carry-on worth of stuff on his person. It's like, that is so smart. I haven't done that yet though.
No, I do always take carry-on, but yeah. I have not tried the fly fishing suit. It's not exactly a good fashion fit for me, but
under a jacket or something.
I'll think about it. Yeah.
So okay. Question number 6. What is one thing you started or stopped doing in order to live or age well?
I have stopped, though maybe a long time ago, worrying about how old or young my friends are. I think that helps you age well, to not see yourself as part of an age cohort, to not think that your life needs to change or develop in some way because of your age. That could also be another thing that I disagree with lots of people about. I think it's good to have let norms of age appropriate behavior weigh very lightly upon you. I definitely have tried to eat more healthfully, as a way of aging less painfully. But I'm sure everyone says that. So yeah,
is there any specific food or beverage you've given up or begun or supplement or anything?
I think at some point, it's been a while, I gave up orange juice. I decided that wasn't as good for me as I used to think it was.
A lot of sugar in that.
Yeah.
Okay. Question number 7. What's one thing you wish every American knew? That's a hard question to ask a U.S. historian, because there are like a million little things that I think of as big things that I wish every American knew. So let me take a moment to see if I could, specifically the people I wish every American knew about the American past. I guess I wish every American knew in some greater detail the history of slavery in the United States. So. Yeah. I do too, and I do want to go sideways on my own enlightening lightning round to ask you, because of course you are a bona fide American historian. I've had a few people on my show, like Mark Charles, who's a member of the Navajo Nation, he ran for president in the last cycle and so forth. And he has a lot to say about this, and other people that I've talked to both on the show and off, that, to say it crassly, that the history of this country is a history of slavery and genocide. And this is something I think we haven't yet really come to terms with as a society. And I'm not sure what it would look like if we did, or how we would do it. But and I know that could be its own hours long conversation, but what's your take on coming to terms with that aspect of our history and maybe healing from it, if that's a thing?
Yeah. So I should say that I agree with that, and I agree with the idea that there needs to be some healing. But when I said before that I wish Americans knew about it, I really just mean I wish they knew more about it. I don't necessarily need Americans to decide that on balance, the story of U.S. history is a story of genocide and slavery. I don't disagree with that. I mean, it's not only that, but I do.
Sure.
But I don't think Americans need to come to terms with that fact. I actually just wish they would know that history a little bit. Now, as for your questions, what it would take to heal, I really don't know. I mean, it is very, very difficult. And it's lots of societies do this. We see this in South Africa, in Germany. What does it mean for people to reckon with either their complicity, which is harder to do when you're talking about intergenerational complicity, or with just their benefit, right? I mean, what do you do with the fact that you and I and most people are the beneficiaries of historical developments and historical misdeeds that no one would consciously repeat?
Right.
So what do? Do you divest yourself of those benefits, and do you just make clear that you're aware of it? Do you try to compensate people that you think of as either the victims or the descendants or the counterparts in some way? I'm more agnostic about that general question. I have views on particular questions. I mean, I do think that transitional justice or transgenerational justice is a coherent concept, and that a lot of the things that people propose for reparations, et cetera, are called for by the demands of justice. I don't necessarily think that heals. I think healing and just policy are different goals. They're both worthy goals, but they're different, and I don't have any particular insights as to how we achieve the healing one. I do think that education is probably the most reliable tool, but education, of course, is a controversial technology, right? People disagree on what should be taught, how it should be taught, and how it should be used to sort of to produce either justice or healing. But I guess the main thing I would say is I don't think that justice and healing, super worthy goals, are necessarily always aligned.
Yeah, I think that's a keen insight. Thank you for that. And thank you for letting me take a tangent off that question. So, okay. Question number 8. What's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about making relationships work?
Always accepting the fact that someone else is going to see things differently from you, and trying hard to understand both perspectives. Try to sort of tell a story as you perceived it, and tell a story as someone else perceived it, and accept the reality, if not necessarily always the legitimacy of someone else's experience.
That's an interesting way to say that. The reality of, even if not the legitimacy of.
I mean, so everyone's experience is legitimate in the sense that everyone's entitled to their experiences. But if you discount someone else's perspective just because you believe firmly that it's inaccurate, and you treat that as the end of the story, then you won't have a relationship with that person. I don't just mean that you'll have conflict and you'll cease to be able to have a relation with that person. You won't actually have a meaningful connection of any sort. You won't actually be able to relate to that person.
Yeah. All right. And the last question here in the Enlightening round is, aside from compound interest, what's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about money?
This is a bad question for me because I have too many thoughts about it. You're hitting all the. All right, I would say that I have learned probably. All right, one thing I'll say is the money you have is not the result of deserving or meriting it. that you may have acquired it legitimately, and you may have acquired it through hard work, but money is one of those things that gets, like other resources, gets maldistributed, distributed haphazardly, and you want to take care of it as you see fit, but and this is not necessarily an argument against private property. It's an argument against thinking of private property or money as one's just desserts in life. I try to decouple the question of wealth from the question of merit or identity. So I have always tried to think of money as a tool. I find getting rid of money very, if I have it, very liberating. I've learned a lot about money from gambling. Actually, I don't do it much these days, but I have always enjoyed gambling. And one of the things I like about gambling is it really not only separates money from questions of merit, it separates money from questions of value, right? If you, when you go, say, to a casino and you risk $10 on the roll of a dice or the turn of a card, you're acknowledging that you're paying for nothing, right?
Yeah.
Maybe entertainment, which is often, like, I like to spend money for experiences rather than for objects, but you're risking the possibility of spending something for nothing. And you're also hoping to get something for nothing. You're hoping to get something in return for nothing, but the fact that you've been willing to make a risk. And this is obviously true not just for gambling. This is true for, obviously, for investments, but true for other things as well. I like the idea that money can be something for nothing, rather than the idea that money represents labor or represents objects of value, because it becomes easier to not live a life where you're constantly thinking about money if you reduce it to a game. Now, obviously, if you don't have enough money for your basic needs, that's not what money is. But for many people I know who have enough money for their basic needs, I mean, they have a job, or they have some kind of family resource, or they have some kind of cushion, they still mostly think of money, as many people do, as representing labor that they've expended, or representing objects that they would like to acquire. And it does represent that in a way, right? But the more I think that I can think about money as just a game, the more likely I am to make good decisions about my life, because then I'll be thinking about experiences and objects and labor, not in terms of their financial equivalent.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that's a very thoughtful perspective, and I suspect I'm going to be reflecting on that for a little while.
Right.
So thank you for that. And speaking of money and gratitude, one of the things that I've done is I've made a microloan to an entrepreneur in Sierra Leone on your behalf through kiva.org.
Oh, great.
There in San Francisco.
Yes. I know it well.
Yeah. She's a 30-year-old named Salamatu. She will use this. She's married. She has 3 children who are all between the ages of 2 and 10. And she runs a retail business. She sells cosmetics. So this money will go to help her grow her business. And then with the interest that's paid, it won't go to me. It'll go to the field partner who manages it. So hopefully that will be part of a virtuous cycle where just the act of us having a conversation, hopefully people listening benefit, but at least one entrepreneur somewhere else in the world hopefully will benefit from this as well. So thank you for
that makes me feel good. I maybe it goes without saying, but I should just make clear what I was saying before, that if you have an attitude toward money that I try to have, which is that it's really, just imagine, it can also make you much more generous. And I'm clearly, you are an extraordinarily generous person. So you've found your way to generosity, however you have. But for me, what's made it easier to be generous, or what reinforces generosity, is not only the example of my father, who was someone who didn't have a lot of money and didn't actually care about things, but was extraordinarily, or maybe and was extraordinarily generous. But also this constant reminder that any money that comes my way is not the result of deserving it. It makes it much easier to give money away, and the gambling thing does that too. You know, if you walk out of a casino and you've lost $100 or $500, and someone on the street asks you for money for food, you're far more likely to give it to them, because you're like, if I'm willing to spend $500 on nothing and give it away to some large corporation, who am I to say no to someone's basic need? But on the other hand, if you win $500, the same thing. You're like, well, this $500 is just the result of random luck. I happen to have it. Here's someone who could actually use it. So anyway, I mean, I know everyone comes to generosity in different ways, and everyone tries to discipline their generosity through different means. And maybe the surprising thing is that I try to do it by taking less seriously rather than more seriously the value of money for myself, and it makes it easier to figure out when someone actually really does need money.
Yeah.
But I should say, on behalf of all of the beneficiaries of your generosity, thank you.
Well, thank you. Okay, so this brings us to the final part of our interview here, and I know we're coming down the stretch. We're about the time we said we'd spend, but the last part here is just an exploration of writing and the creative process, specifically with the idea that things that you share will benefit people listening who want to complete their own writing projects,
right?
And actually want to produce finished work, get it out into the world, get it read, have it make a difference for people, and so forth. So maybe the place to start is just to ask what you've learned about writing and that served you well, and maybe in particular, who has been influential for you as a writer. Like, who have you learned from, either personally or through things you've read, things others have written? Like, who has been meaningful in your development as a writer, and what have you learned from them?
It's a hard question. I mean, I'm someone who always likes to acknowledge debts to other people. So this is hard for me to admit that I don't actually know who has been most helpful to me as a writer. I mean, I read all the time, and I do read lots of fiction, and I read lots of memoir, and I read lots of people who write about writing. So I think about writing that way. I suppose the lesson that I've taken from many of the most influential authors is that it's always about words for me as a reader, and so I try to make it all about words. By which I mean it's about the language as much as it's about the story. It's about the voice that you have as a writer as much as it is about the content or the argument, which is a lesson I cling to obstinately, because I write and I work in a profession that often says the opposite. That's really just about the argument. It's about the research. It's about the analytical coherence, and all those things are important to me. You can't write the kind of books I write without them. But I do see an analogy between all forms of writing, fiction and nonfiction, polemical, argumentative works, and creative, speculative ones. I think in all cases, it's about trying to make words do magical things. Even if you're writing in what seems like very dry language, words are still magical. They're capable of producing surprise and producing sort of wonder in people. And no one's ever said this to me, but people have, my reading and writing experience and has led me to infer from other people that every book is really a story about the language. So every book that's written in English is in some ways about the English language. And I tried to keep that lesson. I don't know which people have influenced me as writers. I'm sure that my father did. My father also wrote books. He wrote books differently from me, but I think he communicated maybe more by example than by precept, or maybe more by the way he also thought about language. Some version of the lesson that I just described. So that's really about like the purpose of writing, or the pleasure of writing. In terms of the discipline of writing, I think that's a hard thing. That's something that I struggle with. I do write somewhat easily the first time around, and then I often have a hard time rewriting and revising. But I think for other people, it's the opposite. The hardest thing is to sort of get it out the first time, and the easiest thing is, once you do, to shape it and sculpt it afterwards. I think that's just a matter of personality. I think we all have a harder time writing in this distracted world, where the same device that we write on is typically the device that we use for our fantasy football teams, or to watch movies, or to conduct the entirety of our social lives, or manage stock portfolios, or consume TikTok videos and things. So that's a really hard thing. And there are obviously all these techniques that you can use to try to shut off the distraction. Or there are people who do things like consecrate one device for writing. And I haven't been so good at doing any of those things. One thing that really helped me write this book in particular was going away every summer, because and during the summers I don't teach, and so that's often when I do I get a lot of my research and writing done. Going away the summer without my books, and so that instead of just sitting around reading about the thing I'm writing about, I'm just saying it's just me and my computer or notepad, and I'm sitting in a cafe. I'm living in a city where I don't speak the language all that well. I speak well enough to solve practical problems, but not well enough to form the kind of social life that would interfere with my work. And I just make the goal to write every day. So there are little things that we all do to try to consecrate time and consecrate energy on writing, but I'm not sure that mine are necessarily useful to other people's.
Yeah. You said that you and your dad wrote books differently. You write books differently. What's the difference?
Well, okay. So my father was a law professor, and and he wrote about constitutional law and international law and human rights. And that's a different kind of writing. I have a brother who's a very successful novelist, and he writes quite differently too. My mother had done some writing, and my other brother mostly communicates with the world through music. Everyone does their thing differently and works in a different genre. But I think that I was probably, both my brothers and I were probably all affected in different ways by our parents' interest in language, and especially, I think, my father's interest in how words work.
Mm. Yeah, you talked about making language do magical things. And I love that as an idea. And someone once pointed out to me, like even the word spelling, right? The connotation of magic, the spells and so forth.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah,
it's kind of interesting. And I know there's no simple trick, to this, but there are people who will talk about stay away from adjectives and adverbs and be more noun based or be more verb based, and, or put I don't even know what you call it, if it's the subject or the payoff at the end of the sentence and things like this, or the use of punctuation, short sentences, more staccato or da-da-da. Like I asked someone once, I said, what are the qualities? So I'll ask you this question too, and I want to keep it in that framework of making language do magical things. But I said, what are the qualities of a great sentence, and how do we write more of them?
So, I mean, all of the things that you mentioned are pieces of advice that I've gotten along the way. I'm not sure I've actually taken any of them to heart, but I do have my own,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
So my thing is prepositions. I don't like them. I don't mean prepositions at the end of something. I mean prepositions at all. So I try to in my own writing and in the writing of my students to encourage them to use verbs that don't require prepositions.
And a preposition, if I recall, these are the on, about, above, between, beyond.
Exactly. So so the difference between inhabiting and living in. So there are other things pro and con, but the verb inhabit. But just to give an example, there are if you, a verb that doesn't require a preposition winds up cleaning up your sentence and I think making it move differently.
Sure.
And I think that if I have sometimes tried to compile lists of great verbs that are preferable to me than some of their alternatives, exclusively because they allow you to get rid of a preposition.
Yeah, that's cool. The thing that this one guest said, I don't remember exactly how he said it, but he said, the example he gave, I'll always remember. He said, "The weapons are in the shed behind the barn." It's like it's clean, it's succinct, it conveys something. Like I was
right.
Like,
No, I think that is a very common lesson I've heard. I have always resisted that. I actually love adverbs.
Yeah,
I think adverbs are great because they say a whole other thing while you're going and put multiple images in your mind and say something subtly and obliquely. I definitely have been told nouns and verbs. No, choose the noun and verb that already incorporates the adjective or the adverb. I get why people do that, and I do like having some short staccato sentences with straightforward sentence structures in my writing, but I actually love adverbs and adjectives, and especially adverbs. The part of speech that I don't like is the preposition. So.
Interesting. What, how aware are you? Well, let me ask this. In your view, are writers born or made, or can they be made? Are you either a writer or not a writer? What's your...
No, but in general, I'm not a people are born kind of person. I'm a people are made kind of person.
Yeah.
Whether it's, they may be made early in life, and may be hard to unmake.
Yeah.
But I don't think that writing is, I don't think we're born with an organ of writing. And I think also writing isn't necessarily just one thing. There's so many different skills and or habits or features or qualities to writing that it'd be hard for me to believe that certain people were meant to write and some people were meant not to write.
Yeah. This might seem like a dumb question. What can we do to improve as writers or to improve our writing?
I think really I have the most conventional possible answer to that, which is read.
Yeah.
Read lots, read differently, read with an ear toward what someone is doing with language and what kind of effect it's having on you as a reader. And also, we do so much writing, all of us. One of the big transitions that I think has taken place during my lifetime is so many things that used to be spoken are now written. Right? And people talk often about the death of the written word, death of the letter. I don't believe any of that. I think the opposite has happened. I think writing is actually much more common than speech in our social lives through email and text and things like that. It's obviously a different kind of writing, and email and text are not the same. And multimedia writing is not the same. So it's not that all writing is the same, but we just do a lot more of it than we used to when we used to conduct so much of our social lives and our business lives over the telephone.
Yeah, no doubt.
So Zoom is interesting because Zoom has sort of reintroduced speech in new prominent ways, over the last couple of years. But the bigger sort of slow change over the last 30 years, I think, has been toward more writing. So all of which is to say that we spend a lot of time composing written text, and that too is writing. And I'm not saying everyone should be like, either pedantically preoccupied with their grammar or artistically, floral or prolific or whatever in their text messages. But you're always developing your own style in every context, and you're always thinking about what you're trying to do with words and how your word choices and sentence structures do things in the world. And I think that's great. I think that's like practice. And if we think about that, it makes it easier to do things like write books or write articles or write poems.
Yeah. How aware are you, or how connected do you feel to your reader while you're in the act of writing?
Not that well connected. It's hard, in academic writing is especially odd that way, because you're trained as a student, and you're in school for all these years, and people have spend 6, 7, 8 years getting PhDs. So teacherly kind of voices are heavily in your ear throughout your training. One or maybe 2 or 3 people are going to read this, and they're going to read it critically, and they're going to read it to assess. And it's a little bit hard to shake that sense of the audience. And as you do more academic writing, more scholarly writing, the audience expands a little bit to include all the people in your field, people who are going to review it, the people who are going to give you jobs or promote you and all that. But it's still not that big. So that's, I think, a challenge when you're in my profession and you're writing. Even when you want to write for a broader audience, you're so conditioned to think of a small number of intense, highly critical, very thorough readers, whereas in fact what you really are writing for is a larger number of not so intense, not so critical, and not so thorough readers. And that transition is difficult. The one thing that's made it easier for me, personality, and maybe it's because I'm a middle child, I don't know, I've always been more attuned to peers than to authority figures. I've always been more aware of the possibility that classmates or friends will be the audience for not just my writing, but for my living, and rather than just parents and bosses and mentors. So I think that's sort of served me well in this way, maybe not in others, but served me well in this way, which is it's a little easier for me to tune out the imagined teacher or advisor or judge, and help me try to write for a community, a group, and then also friends. I have lots of friends, and I value friendship probably as much as any other sort of institution or practice. And when you asked me earlier in the conversation, you prepared me that you would for what's life all about. Friendship was my first thought, and then thought I might expand a little bit. So I do have a little bit of a tendency to try to write for friends. I spent a long time writing a U.S. history textbook with a friend and colleague of mine. So I was writing really for it's very unusual. I was writing for readers who would be forced to read it, and who would be, because they assigned in their college class, and they'd be reading it sort of defensively and reading it just like just for the information to be able to give it back on a test, perhaps. But even in that book, I found myself constantly dropping little Easter egg kind of things for friends of mine, which I do often. So that's maybe an answer that you can't really imagine who your readers are going to be. And one of the nice things about the great publicity that this book has gotten is I get people emailing me now from all parts of the world talking about their own connections to the week, and the biggest sort of experience of it that I have is wow, this is not at all the kind of person I ever imagined would be reading my book. So it is always impossible to imagine your readers, and it's helpful to me sometimes to keep in mind that I'm writing for multiple audiences, and the idea that your friends might read the book, even though they're obviously not the intended audience, is a good way of just keeping an open approach to who the readership might be. Lots of different kinds of people might read it for different reasons in different contexts, and you want it, you just hope that it'll speak to some of them in different ways, maybe ways that you didn't intend, or maybe ways you didn't appreciate. But that's one of the cool things about publication, which is that you let go of these words, and you
never know where they go.
You never know, and you not only never know in advance, you also never know after the fact. You never know what they did. Right?
Yeah, that's awesome, and what a cool thing to have something that you leave behind as well when you're here. That's pretty cool. Okay, so just a couple more questions. So I want to turn to, or maybe return to the practical, or maybe the tactical aspect of your writing. You mentioned in the summers, you'll actually go to a city, go to a coffee shop. I know that's a very personal decision. And I actually think this is part of the challenge for every writer, is figuring out what works for them. Do you write with music or not? Do you write in the morning or in the evening? Do you caffeine? And if so, what form? And, like all of this. So what I wonder is, when you write, like what kinds of routines do you have that support you in producing finished work and producing quality work? Do you use word counts? Do you have a timer? Do you do any, like, what, from big to small, what kind of habits and routines are part of your life?
I have lots of uncommon answers to these. I write at night. I know most people I know like to write in the morning. I sort of think of it as the same thing. You're trying to carve out time where you're least likely to be interrupted, disrupted, or tempted by the activities of other people. So for many people, that's the morning, and for me, it's the night. I write overwhelmingly at night, often between the hours of 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. I can write late at night much more easily than I can read. Often if I'm reading after midnight, I'll get tired or distracted, but writing actually focuses me. So even just the act of typing, I'm like better at answering emails late at night than I am at reading emails late at night. So that's one thing. I do prefer there to be music, which I know is not that common. I also even don't mind if the music has lyrics. A lot of people listen to music but don't want there to be words. I like music. I guess I prefer it to be music that I before. So I'm not actually thinking about too much about who this band is and how that bass line is going or anything like that. So I prefer that, but I do like there to be some kind of music. Too much quiet is bad for me. I like there to be ambient noise, but I don't like there to be people distracting or tempting me off of the computer. That's why music late at night is the right combination. I don't usually use word counts. I do think of paragraphs. I think of paragraphs as the unit of productivity. I also think of paragraphs as the unit of making meaning too. Even in more creative writing projects, I think that I just think of the paragraph is what you work with rather than the page, the sentence, or the word. I'm big on paragraphs, and I definitely when I teach academic writing to my students, I try to give them exercises that reinforce the idea of the paragraph as the fundamental unit of written communication, certainly in writing history. But again, I think of it that way even in other kinds of writing. So if I'm trying to tell myself I need to finish a certain amount, or just trying to assess what I've done, I'll often think of how many paragraphs have I written. I don't do things that people do, like reward myself after every paragraph with some pleasurable activity. But yeah, again, that's the kind of accounting I do is paragraph oriented.
Yeah. Right on. I had never encountered that until I interviewed Todd. I'm forgetting his last name, but he showed me the book he was working on, and it was outlined chapter by chapter, paragraph by paragraph, the whole thing. It's like, oh my gosh, that was wild to me.
I'm incapable of doing that, but I do actually encourage that in my students. I tell them, when we work on outlines, the best outline you could have would be one that tells you what goes in each paragraph.
Yeah.
I aspire to have that, and I may do that informally in my head, but I don't have the discipline or organization to actually produce such an outline.
Yeah, it's Todd Rose, the author of Dark Horse, and he spent time at Harvard and so forth. But before that, I hadn't encountered the power of the paragraph as the fundamental unit of meaning, but I'll think of it that way now. Well, maybe the last thing then is just so two-part question again, or maybe you can consolidate however you want to answer. The first one is what advice or encouragement do you leave anyone listening to this who is either they haven't started their own creative project or they're maybe in the middle of it? What advice or encouragement do you give them to help them finish and get it out into the world? And then the last question is just what final thoughts generally or related to writing? What do you want to leave people listening with?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. I mean, if it makes it easier to finish, as it often does for me, to recognize the fact that once you're actually done, you're still going to wish you had changed this or that. So there, you can't wait for the moment where you feel like this is my last word on the subject, because that moment will never come. And just
if I can just jump in there. I don't know if you use this, but I've heard it said, and it served me. Like, books are never finished, only published.
Right. Yeah, and publication is often a part of a process. And even this book and this conversation, right? So I spent 12 or 13 years researching and writing this. That wasn't the only thing I did those years, but researching and writing this book. Part of the reason it took so long is because I really kept finding more stuff and kept not wanting to end. And the reason why I was able to end, well, I guess it was two. One is I was really ready to write a different kind of book. But also I recognize that this won't be the last word I have on this subject, much as it's not the last word I mean, much as the earlier books that I've written, I'm still sometimes given opportunities to talk about it and elaborate or revise something I've said, and that's happening right now. I mean, the things that we're talking about, especially before we were talking about the week, are not identical to the things that I've said in the book. I mean, I'm very happy with the book when I look at it, but I know it's sort of by its nature unfinished, and conversations that we have like this are opportunities or inducements to keep alive whatever I thought I was doing in the book. So if you can acknowledge that, as you said, books are never finished, they're just published, and the publication is one step in the process of getting your thoughts and your words out to the world, maybe that makes it easier to finish and just say, I'm gonna write other books, I'm gonna publish other things, I'm gonna have other conversations, and life is short, and I want to do this. So, and the other thing is just to appreciate how what a privilege it is. Whatever allows you to spend your time writing a book, whatever financial freedom you're given that enables that, whatever time the people in your life have given you, whatever intellectual or even just verbal or linguistic resources you've been given that allows you to spend time crafting a book over a long period of time. It's like such a privilege. Just keep telling myself that, and it puts all the frustration into perspective. Right. You're doing this for yourself. I mean, obviously you want to communicate with people, but like many acts of expression, you're really doing it for yourself. And most people don't get a chance to do that. They don't have the time or the freedom from having to do something else for money, or just haven't been given the space or the resources to write a book. And one way or another you have. And so just feel good about that, and don't let the book become this sort of external obligation or this symbol of your inadequacy, or this impossible goal to reach. So yeah, that's what I said. And then the other thing, which actually goes back to travel. So one of the things that I like to do is or I'm willing to do that most people aren't. This answers actually several of your earlier questions. Is I'm willing to travel very, very far for a very short period of time. And the reason is, I mean, of course, almost always rather stay for longer. That if you're willing to visit a place or a person for a short period of time, you're much more likely to do it again. And if you tell yourself that you're going to do it again, it's easier to leave the short visits, right? So if you're able to travel frequently, it unburdens each trip, each social visit, each tourist stop. It unburdens that trip from the obligation to do everything that you want to do. I don't have to see everything in the Yucatan. I don't have to visit everyone I know in the Philadelphia metropolitan area, right? Because I'm going to come back.
Yeah.
So if you can do that with, that's something, there is something nice about spending a huge amount of time on a book, and I certainly do that all the time. But you can also say to yourself, I'd like to do this, and I'm going to do it more quickly because I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back to this project. I'm going to come back to another project. I'm going to write more things, and that may unburden them from the obligation to be perfect. Since I am assuming that for many of your listeners and many of the people that you have in mind, it's the perfectionism that makes that as much of an obstacle or an impediment as anything else.
Yeah, that's certainly true in my case, for sure. But I really appreciate what you're sharing about viewing it as, really as the privilege that it is to be able to write a book. It's and simultaneously, I'll just say for myself that there is a view there that's very empowering, but there's also one that has a burden with it. That by comparison, you're blessed to have this, and so many other people don't. Then it starts to feel a little heavy.
Yeah, no, I get that, and I think I've been resisting the temptation to ask you lots of questions. I know that's not the point of this conversation, but I've gathered enough from what I've read about you and from this conversation to understand how that might be especially burdensome for you. I try not to think of it as a burden. I try to think of it as not like I owe the world something because I have the privilege, but just to be happy. There's a famous saying in my own religious tradition, which is the person who is wealthy is the person who is pleased with his or her lot or portion. So I don't think that the idea of privilege should be about feeling guilty or feeling feeling obligated. I think it should be about feeling content and feeling at ease, and then you can approach the obligations that come with whatever privilege you have. But the first thing is to just try to feel pleased with what you have, not self-satisfied or proud or feeling that you deserve it, but just to take some sort of pleasure in it. Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the School for Good Living podcast. Before you take off, I just want to extend an invitation to you. Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life still isn't working for many people. Whether it's here in the developed world where we deal with depression, anxiety, loneliness, addiction, divorce, unfulfilling jobs or relationships that don't work, or in the developing world where so many people still don't have access to basic things like clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or they live in conflict zones, there are a lot of people on this planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, or even if your life is working, but you have the sense that it could work better, consider signing up for the School for Good Living's transformational coaching program. It's something I've designed to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated, or you've gone through a divorce, or you've gotten married, headed into retirement, starting a business, been married for a long time, whatever. No matter where you are in life, this 9-month program will give you the opportunity to go deep in every area of your life, to explore life's big questions, to create answers for yourself in a community of other growth-minded individuals. and it can help you get clarity and be accountable to realize more of your unrealized potential. It can also help you find and maintain motivation. In short, it's designed to help you live with greater health, happiness, and meaning so that you can be, do, have, and give more. Visit goodliving.com to learn more or to sign up today.